So I mentioned, explained a little bit about what a field is for Pierre Bourdieu, the site of struggle. But I mentioned earlier that the resources that people can deploy in a particular field to try and win the struggle are what Bourdieu calls capital. Now, economic capital is pretty straightforward, right? We learned a little bit about Marx, and you pay attention to the world. So it's pretty clear that people that have resources, economic capital, have power to achieve what they want and to dominate the possibilities of others, or to dominate particular fields, like who owns a particular piece of land, or as we're seeing in this election cycle, who owns the ability to have voice and opinions projected out through the media. It comes down to economic power, right? Well, Bourdieu would say right, but then he would put a great big comma in that statement and say, yes, but if we look closely at the social world, we see that it's not only economic capital that is a way of having power in a field. There are other ways. So let me give you an example. Bourdieu would point out that some people appear powerful even though they don't have much economic capital. You can think, for an example, about writers of really important columns in newspapers or really popular books before they make it big. So before J.K. Rowling had all sorts of economic capital, she develops this book, right, called Harry Potter, which has this influence that is beyond the cultural capital. It's about the power of certain ideas being put out there, her own ideas into the social world. So you can think of artists. They might not have economic power at all, but somehow they have a power that we can notice in the social world. And what do we call that power? What is that power? And then Bourdieu might make another observation, such as there are contexts, for example, the university context I gave, in which supposedly all people are equal. It's about intellectual merit, and supposedly economic capital doesn't matter how you do once you're in. But in reality, we see that economic capital mattered to who got in, and then those who do get into university aren't necessarily treated equally. Or it seems that some people just have certain ways of talking, or maybe even, like I'm doing, certain ways of sitting in a classroom and giving off symbols that they have something else. It's not economic capital, but something different, kind of a way of being that seems to have power, a way of talking, using the right words, mentioning the right books they've read, mentioning that they like certain types of food and not others, that they like certain authors or music and not others. And Bourdieu noticed this through his own autobiographical experience, but also over time, and said, there's another capital going on here. What is that sort of capital? So in addition to economic capital, Bourdieu famously writes about this thing he calls cultural capital. And cultural capital for Pierre Bourdieu is really about having the right taste. So it's about being able to show the right knowledge and the right aspects of lifestyle that signify a special inner taste. Now keep in mind, when we talk about capital, we're still talking about resources that can be deployed in a field, a site of struggle, in order to write the rules of the game, but also in order to try and kind of out-elbow or outdo people in that field. So let me give you some examples of cultural capital that could be deployed in particular fields, like a university field. Music, for example. Bourdieu noticed that some people, why is it that some people will talk about opera and having seen the right performances of opera, or having heard the right composers, and that it seems like this more complex elite music, or this more complex music is used by the elite or preferred by the elite. And so he would just note that and say, there's something about this cultural capital being a type of power. But he would also notice that some appear to like artistic or impressionistic, or kind of what what some of us might call strange or useless art. If you've ever seen Jackson Pollock, maybe you'll think this. And that they had a way of seeing and saying that, oh, this has value and this is expressing some deep human thing that you people who like kind of warm, fuzzy Thomas Kincaid sort of paintings, you don't understand. Or he would see that elite people could use great big words and had a way of moving their bodies that weren't about folksy mannerisms of backslapping or of slouching or of kind of eating with the wrong fork. He was able to show that, hey, there's lots of things that are going on that aren't about economic capital, but can show and can deploy power. What do we call that? And his term for that was cultural capital. And he noted that cultural capital had some very distinct aspects that were important for understanding of how inequality worked and how fields, as I've described already, could operate. For example, cultural capital could exclude people without overtly excluding people. So it was exclusion through having the right taste. He noted that cultural capital had a unique ability to signify inner states or to supposedly signify inner worth or inner betterness to other people around, and make other people who didn't have these tastes in music, art, food, bodily position, could make other people seem like those people were just better, or that there's something special about them. Think about Princess Diana for a second here, who's been dead now 15 years, but still people talk about she just had a grace, a certain something, a way of looking, a way of talking, a way of interacting. Well, Bourdieu's saying, she had something we call cultural capital, and that cultural capital is a resource that some people who have it can deploy against some people who don't. And finally, cultural capital, and this is important, can provide coherency to a group of people, particularly in contexts that are supposed to be equitable. So like a university that's supposed to be equitable. Cultural capital can provide coherency and draw lines around a group to exclude other peoples or other groups that don't have it. So it's not just about having money, but it's having the right taste. It's having the right lifestyle in a language that's more familiar to you and I. So he sees cultural capital, he names it, and says it can have just as much effect or just as much power as economic capital. So a quick interlude. Do you believe this? Is there really this thing called capital, called cultural capital? Well, think for a second. Have you ever been around people who use arcane knowledge to impress or exclude other people? Well, for a while I lived in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I remember watching my friends all of a sudden become what I might call wine snobs. All of a sudden they had bottles of wine and they had postures of how you swished, and they had these behaviors of sniffing and sipping and gurgling. And I remember sitting there thinking, what's wrong with these people? I knew these people back in college when we drank the cheapest beer we could get. But as a sociologist, I realized, there's something going on here about they're accruing cultural capital. They're accruing certain tastes and certain behaviors that could set them off. Or think about any time you've been in a situation where you've been made to feel dumb. Or maybe where you faked knowledge about something in order not to feel dumb. These are places that, in Pierre Bourdieu's words, we see cultural capital at work. All right, let me go on quite quickly then to actually, let me hold on, pause for a second if you need to. So let me point you towards yes. So now at this point, it's a great time to take out from the reading the excerpt from this book that I put up on D2L. Go to page 186, figure 9. I'll show you really quick what it looks like here. Actually, let me try and hold this and kind of point some things out. How cultural and economic capital work in Bourdieu's system. So you can look on your own sheet, but let me show you some things. So Bourdieu was famous for trying to give us some real concrete ways to look and see how economic and cultural capital both matter. So this particular chart, the y-axis is what we would call volume or amount of something. And way down here you can see cultural capital and economic capital. He's got negative signs. So down here are, on this chart, which he's talking about, the field of food. On this chart, those that have negative cultural capital, so very little, and negative economic capital, very little, and France would eat salty, fatty, heavy food, cheap, nourishing. You could think, for example, of fast food in the United States. It doesn't take much money, and it's often preferred by those who don't have much economic capital. And it's also doesn't show much quote-unquote cultural capital. It doesn't show taste, right? It's kind of, in some literal way, junk food, right? So it's low on the level of volume. While way up here, high level of volume of both cultural and economic capital. Now, so the y-axis is volume, but plotting out on the x-axis, and this is important because this is different than most diagrams that you may have seen before in your life. If you fall on one side or the other of this axis, shows that you have more cultural capital or more economic capital. So actually over here, he plots, these are people that have lots of economic capital, but don't have that special taste of which cultural capital means. Whereas over here, these are people that have lots of cultural capital, but maybe not much economic capital. So he would say, well, over here, these are kind of your farmer market organic types, right? They, especially hipsters nowadays in our own American context. He's writing about France in the 1970s here, but we'd say, these are people, they don't make a lot of money, but they go for healthy stuff, raw stuff, yogurt, granola. So they have the right taste. They're getting the right foods in terms of cultural capital, but it doesn't necessarily reflect or require a lot of economic capital. But over here, those people that have lots of economic capital, but not necessarily maybe much taste, they're going to spend it all on maybe really strong foods, rich foods, thick taste. So think of cartoons of fat cat capitalists in smoky bars where they're just drinking lots of wine and eating lots of steak and potatoes, and they're shelling out a lot of money for it. So you can see that if you're right on the line here, so if you're not this way on the x-axis or that way, but right here, you have a perfect balance of cultural and economic capital. But what Bourdieu is showing is that culture and economic capital are not the same. You can have lots of cultural capital without, lots of economic capital without much cultural capital, or you can have the opposite. Or you can have high volumes of a balance here. So these would be people with lots of money, lots of cultural taste, live, if you're here in Hollywood or in LA, live high up in the Hollywood Hills, and so try to show refinement because they have lots of cultural capital, but they also have lots of economic capital, so they can also have lots of kind of expensive stuff. So you can see just from this one quick chart that Bourdieu has this kind of uncanny way of relating these concepts. And I want you to pay lots of attention to, where did it go? To the tables in the reading. I can't quite get the page here out of my book, but pay lots of attention to the tables in the reading, because in the tables, Pierre Bourdieu breaks down really clearly this whole range of how people eat, the types of food, the types of pots they use, what they do at dinner time, and he breaks it down by classes to show the relationship between classes and different types of cultural capital and how that's used as a power. Let me pause, I'll be right back.